tonight is the reliability of the resurrection. If we look at the reports that we have in the 4 Gospels about the Passion Week, the last week of the life of Jesus on this earth and the resurrection, one of the main questions we can ask is whether what we read sounds and it is reliable. And also, is there any other supporting evidence that in one or other way is showing us that what we read in the Gospels is something that is historically reliable and verifiable as such? Why is this so important? Well, it is so important because, according to one of the greatest church historians and theologians of his own right, Jaroslav Pelikan, if Christ is risen, really nothing else matters, in universal terms, that is, about the whole creation and the world. If Christ has not risen, also nothing else matters. One apologist and a philosopher, William Lane Craig, would say that without the resurrection of Jesus, nobody would care about the last of Jesus. Also, I would claim that if it is possible in a very definitive way to prove and show that Christ has not risen from the dead, that is in a way the end of Christianity. And this is not something that has come through the development of the Christian thought. Paul himself says exactly that. In one of his letters to the Corinthians, he says, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and also your faith. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are both to be pitied more than all men. When we see the development of early Christianity, immediately after, let's say, the New Testament times, we will see that very early in the development of the Christian understanding of what they have actually witnessed, in the so-called Apostles' Creed, we will see that Pontius Pilate is mentioned, and also Jesus and Mary is mentioned. So this creed actually testifies that the resurrection happened within defined historical context. And we know that from outside of the New Testament evidence and documents that Pontius Pilate was a historical figure, that he was a Roman prefect sent to rule with Judea. And he became a prefect around between the 26th and the 36th year of after Anno Domini AD. So this also indicates that Jesus' trial, death, burial, and resurrection can be investigated on a historical and also on a geographical terms. What we also see in the New Testament, we read about Caesar Augustus, and we know that Caesar Augustus lived somewhat between 30th BC until 14th AD. And Tiberius or Cyrenius, about all of these people, we have records both in the New Testament and also in outside of the New Testament historical documents. Among all of these people is mentioned also Pontius Pilate. You see, why is this so important? Why this sort of a solid historical context is in a way crucial for the Christian witness? Well, let me tell you that we have other religious founders and great religious leaders who may be or may not be, in a way, historical figures, and the message they communicate will not change, and nothing will change in the communication of that message if these people actually did not exist. If you say Buddha or Lao Tzu or Krishna never lived? What if, let's say, Allah decided to give his revelation to somebody else and not to Muhammad? It would not be a big deal, because this would have been specifically God's will about a given human creature. Well, this is not possible to be said about Jesus Christ. Therefore, that is why it is so important for us to accurately understand the geographical and the historical context of the birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So Jesus was born perhaps somewhere between the 6th and the 7th year, what we call now AD, because of various calculations of when Jesus was born in the past. Now we actually believe that the most accurate thing is that he was born around the 7th year BC, because we can gather all of this information from specifically the Gospel of Luke. We have the census in the time of Caesar Augustus, the first which takes place during Quirinius, who was governor of Syria. We see there was some special constellation of stars about which Matthew 2, 1-11 is telling us about the Bethlehem star. And that's how we can come to such a specific point of history when Jesus was born. So there is a material, New Testament, but also objective material outside of this context to kind of show us and support the view when Jesus was born. So Jesus was definitely a historical figure. And we take that the year of AD 30 was the most probable year when Jesus Christ was crucified, and then when he resurrected. Besides all of these recordings that we have in the New Testament, we also have very early in the development of the New Testament and the early Christianity and early Christian documents, we have outside of the New Testament records from people who are not necessarily friendly. Actually, all of them are hostile to Christianity. Take, for example, Tacitus. In his Roman Annals, he has written it between 115 and 117 AD, almost within a living memory of many of the eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ. This is what Tacitus says. The name Christian comes from Christ, who was executed under the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. We also have a record written about the historical Jesus from Flavius Josephus. He lived between 38 and 100, so he was even more contemporary to the New Testament times than Tacitus. So he mentions Jesus' brother himself. There is a longer version of mentioning Jesus in that context, but we now believe that this longer version actually comes from a bit later time. But one is sure, these few sentences that are written about Jesus Christ are quite accurate. I mean, they can be believed that were written by Flavius Josephus. And besides all of these things that we have said so far, if we read the New Testament, and especially if we pay attention to the Gospel of Luke, we will actually see, for anyone who understands a little bit of how historians work and what historians do, it will be quite possible to actually conclude that Luke is taking this task to the best of the ability of what he could do, of what he knew, how history was recorded and written in his time. Therefore, he is very careful to actually explain to his readership that it is not only him who is writing this record, but many other people have undertaken the effort to write about Jesus Christ. While he is writing at that time, there are eyewitnesses who actually can easily access this report and say if this was right or it was not. Also, he uses a very technical word in the Greek language, which he says carefully. I have carefully researched about what I'm going to write. And then he is arranging all of those events in the life of Jesus Christ because he wants to communicate a certain pattern. All of these things actually would be done by an able historian. But before we continue onwards, let me address one specific issue that very often comes on the surface when we talk about the life of Jesus Christ and the resurrection in contemporary times. Very often, we actually think the contemporary human beings who do not even believe in God think that the people who live, especially in a, let's say, pre-modern times, and the people who believed and who lived in ancient history were very credulous people, which means they would believe anything. You tell them any unbelievable, miraculous story, and they will simply say, yes, we believe that. So the question is whether the ancient people were so credulous, so they believed the resurrection as one of the other myths that they also believe. Well, in his very important book, N.T. Wright, The Resurrection by N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God, he thoroughly examines the non-Jewish thought of the first century. The conclusion he makes is that in the Mediterranean world, both in the East and in the West, that people of that time, of the time of Paul and Jesus Christ, were not easily to believe in the bodily resurrection of a dead person. Actually, to the Greco-Roman mindset, the soul of the spiritual realm was good and the physical or material world was weak and corrupted. Therefore, it's not a surprise to see that when Paul himself comes to Athens and he starts preaching the gospel, he is basically specifically ridiculed when he mentions the resurrection of the dead at the Areopagus. Aeschylus, one of the most seminal and most important ancient Greek writers, puts the following words in the mouth of the divinity Apollo. Once a man dies and the earth drinks his blood, there is no resurrection. So the immortality of the soul is one thing, but the resurrection of the body was seen as absurd and undesirable. So you think, okay, the Greco-Roman world was not so interested in this. They couldn't have believed the resurrection, but actually the resurrection happened within specifically the Jewish and Hebrew religion. And yes, you're right to believe that the Jewish people did not share the same values and understanding about the world as the Greco-Roman people. They actually did believe in the goodness of creation. For them, that was not a release from prison, as it were, but it was a tragedy. However, many of the Jews of the Jesus time believed that at the end of times, there will be resurrection. This is precisely also what Mary, the sister of Lazarus, says to Jesus when he says, Lazarus will be resurrected. About another resurrection we can talk. She says, yes, at the end of times, he will be resurrected. So it was also very difficult for an average Jewish person to believe that there will be such a thing as the resurrection of one individual body, especially of the Messiah, if the rest of the world is still not transformed. Actually, one of the arguments that the rabbis throughout medieval times, when they were living in minorities all dispersed all over the world, and they were actually not very often, they had to explain themselves within a majority Christian context. When one of the rabbis was asked, why don't they believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah? He said, well, sir, if that Messiah has resurrected from the dead, I don't see anybody else being resurrected. I don't see a lion living with a lamb, and I don't see people living happy lives. So for the average Jewish person at the time when Jesus Christ resurrected, although they believed in a general resurrection, would have been extremely difficult to believe that this has happened had it not transformed immediately the whole world. So much about the credibility. So we see that to write about the resurrection in the ancient time, when this was written, was as complex, as difficult, as challenging, and as unbelievable as it is perhaps today. So there is no way of us to think that because we are more advanced people, that's why we don't believe in the resurrection. And it was easier to write about resurrection, and some people do not believe in the resurrection simply of different times. On the contrary, it seems that to write about the resurrection at the time when it was written, it was extremely difficult to sell as propaganda. So it would have been very unlikely for people to start writing about something that actually did not happen when they knew that the whole setting was completely against such a claim. Now, when we see the recordings about the resurrection itself, specifically in the New Testament, we see through three groups of witnesses who have witnessed the empty tomb. We have the soldiers who have guarded the tomb. We have the women who came to anoint the body and they found the tomb empty. And we have the disciples who were informed about the empty tomb by the woman. Something very, very interesting is going on here. If you are careful to read about the initial reaction of all the people who were reported, the disciples who were reported about the resurrection of Jesus, we don't see reactions such as, of course, yes, Jesus has resurrected. Yeah, of course he did. We believe you. No, the disciples were not prepared for the resurrection. They were utterly surprised. Another very interesting moment for us to observe is that if the original writers wanted to invent such an unbelievable occasion, they perhaps would have tried to make the story be as close to the religious sentiments of the people to whom they wrote as possible. Therefore, choosing Jesus to resurrect on Sunday, which in essence is the first day of the week, and it's not a holiday, it's strange. One would think if this is invented, one would have chosen Saturday as a day of resurrection, because that was the holiday of the Jewish people. And there is one more aspect to add to the layer of the credibility of the resurrection itself. Because the story itself is, when you read it in all of the four Gospels, is very simple. It actually lacks any kind of legendary and mythological developments. And we know that simply from reading other ancient documents. When you read something which has been developed for decades and decades, and even sometimes in centuries, you will see an embellishment around the story itself, really a myth developing. If you read the Gospels, all of this, specifically for the trained eye, are lacking. So, we have eyewitnesses, but we also have recordings about the appearances of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians, something very important happens. Apostle Paul is not an eyewitness of the resurrection itself, and he has never seen Jesus Christ on this earth. We know about this event on the road to Damascus, of course, but this is Jesus appearing to Paul, more or less, from heaven. And why is this so important is because Paul is now taking, when he writes to the Corinthians, is taking an already established story, which is actually very close to the original occasion. he is writing 25 years approximately after the events of the resurrection. He is writing between the year 56 and 57 AD. And this is what he says: I have passed on to you that which I received. And in that way, he's actually he's speaking in Greek, but there is an early Aramaic kind of Christian formula. And it is very, very possible that it dates even earlier than the time when Apostle Paul is writing, because he said, I'm passing on you something that I have received, which is already established history, let's say. And he names in this context Peter Cephas, which is the Aramaic version of the name Peter. And when you see the formula, you clearly see a certain creedal style. It is not typical of how Paul writes, which means perhaps Paul is not taking this only by memory, by someone dictating it to him, saying it to him, but he's actually copying it from another written material. And Paul says, Jesus Christ has appeared. He has been seen by eyewitnesses, and he has been seen by Cephas, Peter, and the disciples. In this context, that means that we are talking about historical, physical, bodily appearances of Jesus after he was buried, and after people have recorded that they have seen him. One thing is for sure, even the people who doubt that Jesus Christ has ever resurrected from the dead, or are certain that dead people cannot rise from the dead, agree that when we read the materials about Peter and the early disciples, it is a historically absolutely certain, even if they didn't experience this, but historically what is written about them and how they express it, it is absolutely certain that they believed that Jesus had appeared to them alive after the crucifixion. Alive and in body, not a spiritual appearance, but they could touch, they could see this body could eat, and they could share a meal with him. Had this all been really only an invention of the mind of the disciples, for example, the oral tradition had to be unanimously corrupted in a very short period of time, because they all had to agree that he was raised physically from the dead. And usually such corruption happens in a much longer period, as we said. The period about what they are recording and what they are reporting is absolutely very short for this to happen. So Paul converted perhaps around AD 33, and Jesus Christ was crucified in AD 30. We're talking about only 3 years apart from the one event to the other. So there is no any responsible way of how we can simply write off the recordings of the resurrection as if they have not happened. I'm not saying that we cannot doubt them, and some people are not even allowed to doubt them. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, there is no responsible way to say, we have read these reports, we are aware of these reports, and we can certainly say without further investigation, they're all wrong. Impossible. Jesus Christ has shown to many people, and in the Gospels, there are some names that are actually mentioned. We are talking about Mary Magdalene in John 20. He appears to other women in Matthew 28, 8 to 10. He has appeared to Cleopas and other disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. He has appeared to the 11 disciples and others. Then he appears to the 10 apostles in John 20, when Thomas is not around. And a bit later, he appears to all the apostles with Thomas present and him touching his wounded body. He is also then appearing to the 7 apostles in John 21. He is appearing to the disciples in Matthew 28. And then he is with the apostles on the Mount of Olives before his ascension in Luke 24. When we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, theories can be different about what happened to him and what happened to his body. But everybody agrees the tomb was empty. No one in the early Christianity, from the earliest period of time, questioned that the tomb was empty. The question was how the tomb became empty. So it is very difficult to deny the tomb on a historical basis. Those who deny the empty tomb, they actually deny it on a theological and ideological basis. You see, I had a very interesting experience with one person. His name is Philip Pullman. He's an English author. He writes books, and he has written several very, very successful books for children, actually. And movies have been made. But besides other things, he also wrote a book called The Good Man Jesus and the Rascal Christ. It is a radical retelling of the story of Jesus according to him. And in this story, Mary has twin sons. One is called Jesus and the other is called Christ. Jesus is a very nice sage. He's a very kind of good-hearted and very wise person. And he doesn't care about fame or anything. But Christ, who lacks all of these qualities, is a rascal that wants to be a celebrity. So if Jesus and Christ lived in the 21st century, perhaps the one would have been this withdrawn and private person writing some very wise thoughts for himself. And the other one would be all over the Instagram or wherever and showing off with the statements from his brother stolen from him. So this man, I went to the launch of his book, and this man was talking about all of these things and how he doesn't believe in God, how he doesn't believe in the Gospels, etc., etc. And then one person gets up and asks one simple question. He says, "Mr. Pullman, you are you have worked, you work with words. You're a very smart person, and you've been a journalist. Tell me, please, if you read the 4 Gospels on their own accord, without any ideological input into them, just read them as a journalist, how would you describe them?" And this is his answer. He says, "You know what? If I read them as a journalist on their own account, the 4 Gospels, as I read them, they really, really look credible. You ought to believe them. But dead people do not resurrect, therefore, they must be wrong." So his statement was really not based on what he was reading as a material on a historical basis. His response was definitely ideological response. I don't believe in God, dead people do not resurrect. Therefore, although this is very credible, I can't believe it. Then we have some very interesting descriptions in the Gospels about how the clothes were folded in the grave, in the tomb. Very, very interesting detail there that perhaps if it is again invented, it is hardly possible that such a detail will be there mentioned. Then Paul mentions Jesus' tomb and puts it in the contrast to the tomb of David, which means that the tomb of Jesus is empty, and the tomb of David, there are bones in it. Also, let's see how the early Christianity develops out of this firm belief that Christ has risen. There was an absolutely established and unanimous firm belief in the resurrection for the early Christians. So there is no Christian, pagan, or Jewish precursor to the resurrection. There is no such thing, there is such an information that has happened on which supposedly the authors that are inventing this event could have borrowed some material and made it appropriate for their own means and ends. So the coming of the existence of the followers of Jesus Christ is really something quite unseen until that moment on the scene of history. There is no way how any serious historian can take the New Testament report without taking them with a serious kind of approach and give them a due respect. They don't have to believe them eventually, but they have to reckon with them. And there are several theories that are developed in order to explain how this material is so credible. How can we explain the empty tomb? For example, in the 19th century, we had a theory which was called the conspiracy theory. And that meant that it was the disciples have stolen the body of Christ. But it is actually morally impossible to incite the disciples to such a crime. These people sincerely believed the message they preached. So the conspiracy theory cannot be supported by the catastrophe which the crucifixion would otherwise have been. You know, the crucified Messiah without the resurrection is no Messiah at all. Another attempt to explain the death of Jesus Christ is the so-called apparent death theory. This theory says basically that Jesus Christ actually did not die. He was just, passed out, and then he was taken from the tomb. He revived, and then after the disciples that he was resurrected. Well, this theory is more or less, I would say, almost virtually abandoned. Nobody believes it. It is very difficult to believe such a theory, especially if you read some of the recordings of the Gospels that are basically explaining what has happened to Jesus physically, being whipped with such a brutal way by the Romans, a crown thorn put on his head, crucified in such a, dying in such a terrible thing on that cross, and then one of the soldiers piercing his rib, and then water, according to the record of the gospel, water and blood. And of course, at that time, people did not have any medical knowledge to know that when from the body cavities comes out liquid that is both looks like water and blood, that is an absolute sign for a certain death, because the blood has already started sort of disintegrating. There is no blood working through the body. Another popular theory for the possible explanation of how is it possible to believe that Jesus actually resurrected but he didn't is the so-called hallucination theory. Basically, the disciples had a hallucination and they believe. Well, hallucination, first of all, is always associated with people with mental instances or people who have had some sort of a substance abuse. First of all, the disciples did not expect Jesus to rise. So to come to a hallucination of something which you don't expect is highly improbable. They did not have any reason to enter into such a hallucination. Also, Jesus Christ was not seen only once by one person, and not only by believers. And skeptics and hallucination cannot contain anything that is not already in your mind. Basically, if you don't have something as a preconceived idea, it cannot come into your mind. None of these things would have been possible for the early disciples. They would have based action on the known figures to have left the earth in body alive. And we have such descriptions of this happening in the Old Testament, namely Elijah or Enoch. So the hallucination theory is not viable, and nor could hallucinations explain all of the evidence because they leave the empty tomb again unexplained. Some people also try to say that all of these things were not to be believed simply because of the existence of the so-called Gnostic Gospels. Well, the Gnostic Gospels, all of the recording that we have today, come definitely much later, about 100 years or so later and more than the canonical, let's say the canonical Gospels. And some historians, ancient historians, even some theologians and New Testament scholars who also don't believe in the actual accuracy and the reliability of the Gospels are saying that this is very possible, that we should actually reconstruct the real history and life of Jesus, not only based on the canonical Gospels, but also on whatever the so-called Gnostic Gospels have said. But actually, if you read the Gnostic Gospels and pay any specific attention, you will immediately know that we are talking about categorically different kind of literature and different kind of genre and different kind of credibility. You can't even come close. The credibility based on what you can do by investigating literature, when you compare the canonical Gospels to the Gnostic Gospels, is just the Gnostic Gospels are immediately recognized as something which was written much later, with much more mythological and in such way incredible data inputted in them. These were genuinely, in this case, reflecting the ideology and the times when a given author happened to write this. Simon Gathercole, when he, a theologian and New Testament scholar, when he is thinking about this particular issue, is saying that when he comments on the Gospel of Judas, that he says the Gospel of Judas was written as if someone were today to produce a document purporting to be a diary of Queen Victoria, who lived obviously in the 19th century, in which, in these letters, the Queen Victoria is discussing the Lord of the Rings and goes on, and she is putting a list of her songs on her iPod. And N.T. Wright goes on to reveal that this point was strikingly confirmed by James M. Robinson, the esteemed translator of the Nag Hammadi codices. And he said that he is absolutely sure that the resurrection of Jesus Christ, compared to what we have in the Nag Hammadi, is just like, you can't even come close in certain comparison. Having said all of these things about the resurrection, now, and about the credibility of the resurrection, let us think then, eventually, what does the resurrection mean for us today? What does resurrection then mean for all of us who believe that actually Jesus Christ has resurrected? I believe that we all still, to this very day, those documents give us absolute plausibility to be able to say that what we believe is not a fiction of imagination, is not based on illusion, on a hallucination, or on a plot of a conspiracy theory. But if this has really happened, then what does it mean? Well, it means that God, who is transcendent to his creation, is able, by his all-powerful nature, to open himself and allow the creation, through the incarnation of Jesus Christ, to participate in the life of God. Something which is transcendent to this world from the outside has now broken on the scene of history. You know, most of the people to this very day, regardless whether they believe or do not believe in God, they're always feeling that there is something more to life than what they can experience right here and right now. So this hope then of the resurrection, that the resurrection gives us, it is for the whole world. It is not just for us. It is actually a hope that goes beyond and beyond our, let's call them, wildest dreams. And what resurrection enables us is that to put our faith in Jesus Christ, to put our faith in his physical, historical resurrection, to put our faith in Jesus Christ overcoming death, being victorious over death, and on this promise that we can participate in this particular resurrection and also enter eternal life, which according to Jesus Christ is to know Jesus Christ himself and the Father whom he reveals. So on that basis, we believe that then we can live a life of hope. According to the great German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, hope based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not hope that makes us docile and just like some sort of a modern Stoics, take all the context and all the happening of our lives as if something that we must go through, and the less we kind of react to the environment around us, the better for us. On the contrary, says Jürgen Moltmann, the real hope of the resurrected that comes from the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ makes us unrestful. Yes, we need to be steadfast. Yes, we need to be patient. Yes, we need to be meek. Yes, we need to accept even suffering in the name of Jesus Christ. But this does not mean that we should be in any way indifferent to the condition of the world. Because Jesus Christ has resurrected from the dead, because of that, we have a hope that actually certifies that we are already participating in the life of Jesus Christ. We are just waiting for his second coming. And we believe that what God has done for us, for the people, in Jesus Christ, God will do to the whole creation. So creation is then good. If Christ has been incarnated and Christ has died for us, but has not finished there, if Christ has resurrected from the dead, that means a final verdict not only of who Jesus Christ is, not only that sin and death are overcome, but this is a final verdict of the goodness, on the goodness of God's creation. And if God's creation is good, the church in the midst of coronavirus and pandemic can be a church full of hope. The church that is facing all kinds of challenges in its own witness and life today can be absolutely certified that on Sunday, on this coming Sunday, actually in this part of the world to which we all belong, Ukraine and Macedonia, we can certainly on the Sunday morning say to each other, Christos Voskrese. And the real answer, and the answer from the other side would be, Vaistinu. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And that in many ways opens the opportunity and the possibility for us to have an intellectually, in a way, credible faith, that we can be plausible in the explanation on the market, if I may say, of the worldviews. And we don't have to be embarrassed as we are actually perpetrating some sort of an unbelievable story as the Tooth Fairy or about Santa Claus, which could disintegrate at first or second probing question. No, we believe in God who has resurrected from the dead because he's a historical figure. It is Jesus Christ on whom everything stands. So if Jesus Christ was not Jesus Christ, if he did not really, was not the real person that we are talking about, if Jesus Christ was not incarnated, if he did not live, if he did not suffer, if he did not die, and if he did not resurrect, everything that we say about the Christian faith is futile. We can pick up only the generic religious platitudes and become one of the other kind of stories about mythological stories or other religions that are trying to convey their story, regardless whether they're founders or the people with whom this religion is associated as founders really existed or they didn't. With Christianity, the whole thing is radically different. If Christ is risen, nothing else matters. If Christ is risen, if Christ is not risen, nothing else matters. We have all the right to believe that he is risen indeed, and on that basis to go and respond to the great commission that Jesus gave us after he has resurrected, to go and preach and make disciples from all the people on the earth. Thank you.